Federalist Number 8. The Consequences of Hostility Between the States, from the New York Packet, Tuesday, November 20th, 1787. To the people of the State of New York. Assuming it, therefore, as an established truth that the several states, in case of disunion, or such combinations of them as might happen to be formed out of the wreck of the general Confederacy, would be subject to those vicissitudes of peace and war, of friendship and enmity with each other, which have fallen to the lot of all neighboring nations not united under one government, let us enter into a concise detail of some of the consequences that would attend such a situation. America dissolving their federal union would cause more problems than it would fix. War between the states, in the first period of their separate existence, would be accompanied with much greater distress than it commonly is in those countries where regular military establishments have long obtained. The disciplined armies have always kept on foot on the continent of Europe, though they bear a malignant aspect to liberty and the economy, have, notwithstanding, been productive of the signal advantage of rendering sudden conquests impracticable, and of preventing that rapid desolation which used to mark the progress of war prior to their introduction. The art of fortification has contributed to the same ends. The nations of Europe are encircled with chains of fortified places which mutually obstruct invasion. Campaigns are wasted in reducing 2 or 3 frontier garrisons to gain admittance into an enemy's country. Similar impediments occur at every step to exhaust the strength and delay the progress of an invader. Formerly, an invading army would penetrate into the heart of a neighboring country almost as soon as intelligence of its approach could be received. But now a comparatively small force of disciplined troops, acting on the defensive, with the aid of posts, is able to impede and finally frustrate the enterprises of one much more considerable. The history of war in that quarter of the globe is no longer a history of nations subdued and empires overturned, but of towns taken and retaken, of battles that decide nothing, of retreats more beneficial than victories, of much effort and little acquisition. Continental Europe shows us that standing armies, which are necessary in those European nations to make sure none of their hostile neighbors try to invade, cause problems with the general populace, who come to see the armies as their masters rather than their protectors, as a point of necessity because of that threat of invasion. Likewise, when those armies would invade other countries, it increased the general indemnity of the populace that was being invaded, towards standing armies in general. The changing nature of wars and armies changes the full dynamic how the populace interfaces with those armies. They no longer go in and conquer and hold countries, they invade and take towns, and frequently then retreat when the defending army stalls their progress, so nothing was gained, except the populace suffers as the result of their autocratic leaders playing what amounts to war games from both sides of the conflict. In this country, the scene would be altogether reversed. The jealousy of military establishments would postpone them as long as possible. The want of fortifications, leaving the frontiers of one state open to another, would facilitate inroads. The populous states would, with little difficulty, overrun their less populous neighbors. Conquests would be as easy to be made as difficult to be retained. War, therefore, would be desultory and predatory. Plunder and devastation ever march in the train of irregulars. The calamities of individuals would make the principal figure in the events which would characterize their military exploits. In our country, a disunited union would cause the same sorts of problems, but they would be compounded because the system of defenses that encapsulates most municipalities in Europe did not yet exist in the several states. We already know the larger and more populous states could easily overrun the small and more sparsely populated states due to the lack of these fortifications. They would do so to plunder the populace of their property and rights, then leave when the native armies stalled their progress, and retaliatory invasions would fuck the population on both sides of the conflict. This would cause the invadees to put more focus on having a strong and capable regular standing army, and that would increase how likely those states would be to use their armies in plunder and retaliation of plunder. This picture is not too highly wrought, though, I confess, it would not long remain a just one. Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. Even the ardent love of liberty will, after a time, give way to its dictates. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel nations the most attracted to liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. These conditions would eventually cause the populace to give up their natural rights in order to better support their own standing army, so they could protect the native populace from attacks and plunder. In order to become safer, they would naturally be more willing to give up their liberty to prevent the risk of death and theft from external militaries, which pose a danger to the native population. The institutions chiefly alluded to are standing armies, and the correspondent appendages of military establishments. Standing armies, it is said, are not provided against the new Constitution, and it is therefore inferred that they may exist under it. Their existence, however, from the terms of the proposition, is at most problematical and uncertain. But standing armies, it may be replied, must inevitably result from a dissolution of the Confederacy. Frequent war and constant apprehension, which require a state of as constant preparation, will infallibly produce them. The weaker states, or confederacies, would first have recourse to them, to put themselves upon the equality with their most potent neighbors. They would endeavor to supply the inferiority of a population and resource by a more regular and effective system of defense, by disciplined troops, and by fortifications. They would, at the same time, be necessitated to strengthen the executive arm of government, in doing which their constitutions would acquire a progressive direction towards monarchy. It is the nature of war to increase the executive at the expense of the legislative authority. This situation would cause every state to make their standing army so strong, to abate the fear their populace would be feeling, that would increase the pace at which all governments become autocracies and necessitate the strengthening of their executive branches to the point that many would become indistinguishable from monarchies. Those situations always increased the executive at the expense of the legislative. This was the whole point of Rome's dictator clause, which gave power to one strong leader in times of war, and made the Senate and other civil offices completely subordinate to that power. The expedients which have been mentioned would soon give the states or confederacies that made them use of a superiority over their neighbors. Small states, or states of less natural strength, under vigorous governments and with the assistance of disciplined armies, have often triumphed over large states, or states of greater natural strength, which would have been destitute to those advantages. Neither the pride nor safety of more important states or confederacies would permit them long to submit to this mortifying and adventitious superiority. They would quickly resort to a means similar to those which had been effected, to reinstate themselves in their lost preeminence. This we should, in a little time, see established in every part of the country of the same engines and despotism which have been the scourge of the old world. This, at least, would be the natural course of things, and our reasonings will be the more likely to be just, in proportion as they are accommodated to this standard. These situations would cause the states to follow suit into the pitfalls of continental Europe has long been subject to. Attacks and standing armies moving around, and reprisals for attacks would bring about the exact same kind of despotism that plagues the old world. These are not vague inferences drawn from the supposed speculative defects of a constitution, the whole power of which is lodged in the hands of the people, or their representatives and delegates. But they are solid conclusions drawn from the natural and necessary progress of human affairs. This would be inevitable, as human history has shown us time and time and time again. It may, perhaps, be asked, by way of objection to this, why did not standing armies spring up out of the contentions which so often distracted the ancient republics of Greece? Different answers, equally satisfactory, may be given to this question. The industrious habits of the people of the present day, absorbed in the pursuits of gain, and devoted to the improvements of agriculture and commerce, are incompatible with the condition of a nation of soldiers, which was the true condition of the people of those republics. The means of revenue, which have been so greatly multiplied by the increase of gold and silver and of the arts of industry, and the science of finance, which is the offspring of modern times, concurring with the habits of nations, have produced an entire revolution in the system of war, and have rendered disciplined armies, distinct from the body of citizens, the inseparable companions of frequent hostility. Did these sorts of defaults to autocracy affect the ancient Greek states? Yes, but not to so great a degree, because people were busy tending to their farms and families and normal business to give into the autocratic nature of government that comes with a large standing army. There were professional armies in ancient Greece, but they primarily bothered one another, not the populations of their neighbors, because too much exculpatory work had to be done to provide the government with enough money, material goods, and recruits to have large professional armies. But now that so much progress has been made in figuring out how to get food and money and material into the government coffers, because people are better at growing things and making money and spending money than they were 2,300 years ago, this problem will be compounded within the states. The governments can gather together enough of each to have and ferment large-standing professional armies, and the above problems will be a direct result of this change in how things are done, and make the danger of those standing armies much greater than it was for the ancient Greeks. There is a wide difference, also, between military establishments in a country seldom exposed by its situation to internal invasions, and in one which is often subject to them, and always apprehensive of them. The rulers of the former can have a good pretext, if they are even so inclined, to keep on-foot armies so numerous as they must of necessity be maintained in the latter. These armies being, in the first case, rarely, if at all, called into activity for interior defense, for the people are in no danger of being broken to military subordination. The laws are not accustomed to relaxations. In favor of military exigencies, the civil state remains in full vigor, neither corrupted nor confounded with the principles or propensities of the other state. The smallness of the army renders the natural strength of the community an overmatch for it. And the citizens, not habituated to look up the military power for protection, or to submit to its oppressions, neither love nor fear the soldiery. They view them with a spirit of jealous acquiescence in a necessary evil, and stand ready to resist power which they suppose may be exerted to the prejudice of their rights. Countries which don't face the threat of internal invasions don't have to worry about the above-listed problems. They don't need to keep large armies roaming around their countryside in order to stave off invasion or threat of invasion. Since the populace does not always have to deal with the military running around the land, they don't feel like they need to subordinate their rights and property to the state, or feel tread upon by their smaller and less frequently used and mobilized militaries. Without the need to submit to their armies in order to feel safe, these populations would also feel no need to submit any other rights to the government to facilitate that safety. Instead of viewing their militaries as potential oppressors, they don't hold any fear or specific enmity towards them, as would a nation that has to have a large army running around to protect their populace would, so it totally bypasses the problems which have been drowning Europe in tyranny and oppression for millennia. The army, under such circumstances, may usefully aid the magistrate to suppress a local faction, or an occasional mob, or insurrection, but it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of the great body of the people. The smaller army of a nation which is not in constant fear of invasion and reprisal won't be as likely to trample on their population's right and property, and the whole system will be kept in check because if your government's power is restricted so they can't become tyrants, then your populace won't have to worry about being under the chains of tyranny, and you can avoid all of the above problems. In a country in the predicament last described, the contrary of all this happens. The perpetual menacings of danger oblige the government to always be prepared to repel it. Its armies must be numerous enough for instant defense. The continual necessity for their service enhances the importance of a soldier, and proportionably degrades the condition of the citizen. The military state becomes elevated above the civil. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subjected to the frequent infringements of their rights, which serve to weaken the sense of those rights, and by degrees the people are brought to consider the soldiery not only as their protectors, but as their superiors. The transition from this disposition to that of considering them masters is neither remote nor difficult, but it is very difficult to prevail upon the people under such impressions, and to make bold or effectual resistance to usurpation supported by the military power. In nations where the government and population are in perpetual fear of invasion or reprisal for invasions, you will get all of these problems and more. The importance of the military, and the task before said military takes precedence over the rights and property of the general population, and the military then becomes superior to the civil. It will cause a feedback loop which will faster and faster drown the population in tyranny, as they give up more and more of their rights and privileges to the military, who as a matter of national defense will require the government supersedes their population's natural rights in order to prop up the military to counter invasions and attacks. It will accelerate this problem until no one has any rights left, except the military, who will then have to dictate the application of law and confiscation of property to bolster self-defense. The kingdom of Great Britain falls within this first description. An insular situation and a powerful marine, guarding it in a great measure against the possibility of foreign invasion, supersede the necessity of a numerous army within the kingdom. A sufficient force to make head against the sudden descent, till the militia could have time to rally in a body, is all that has been deemed requisite. No motive of national policy has demanded, nor would public opinion have tolerated, a larger number of troops upon its domestic establishment. There has been, for a long time past, little room for the operation of the other causes, which have been enumerated as a consequence of internal war. This peculiar felicity of situation has, in great degree, contributed to preserve liberty, which that country to this day enjoys, in spite of some of the prevalent venality and corruption. If, on the contrary, Britain had been situated on the continent, and had been compelled, as she would have been in that situation, to make her military establishments at home coextensive with those of other great powers of Europe, she, like them, would in all probability be at this day a victim of the absolute power of a single man. It is possible, though not easy, that the people of the island may be enslaved from other causes, but it cannot be the prowess of an army so inconsiderable as that which has been usually kept up within the kingdom. Great Britain is an example of this. Since it is an island with a strong navy that can defend invasions long before they ever reach their native shores, they don't have the need to have large standing armies roaming around the countryside to provide for their defense, and as a result, the population is freer, happier, and much more respectful towards the government and military for it. If Britain did have to have armies roaming around to protect it from invasion and plunder, instead of offshore navies, they would not be nearly as free, and they would no doubt have to live under the total autocratic monarchy in order to administer the state's resources into something that could manage, supply, and support these large armies. That Great Britain doesn't have armies running around is why it is a parliamentary system with a more limited government than the rest of Europe. If we are wise enough to preserve the Union, we may for ages enjoy an advantage similar to those of an insulated situation. Europe is at a great distance from us. Her colonies in our vicinity will be likely to continue too much disproportionate strength to be able to give us any dangerous annoyance. Extensive military establishments cannot, in this position, be necessary to our security, but if we should be disunited, and the integral parts should either remain separated or, which is most probable, should be thrown together into 2 or 3 confederacies, we should be, in a short course of time, in the predicament of the continental powers of Europe. Our liberties would be prey to the means of defending ourselves against the ambition and jealousy of each other. If America follows suit by remaining a federated nation of states in a union, it will likewise operate as an island on the continent, holding their potential foes at bay, but not fearing any invasion or violence from their individual neighbor states, and will for ages after remain free and prosperous and safe. If they don't retain the Union, then all of the above will inevitably happen and make America look just like Europe, with its wars and tyranny and lack of rights. It would destroy everything the revolutionaries fought for, and erode liberty faster and faster as time went on, and the states became complete autocracies. This is an idea not superficial or futile, but solid and weighty. It deserves the most serious and mature consideration of every prudent and honest man of whatever party. If such men will make a firm and solemn pause, and meditate dispassionately on the importance of this interesting idea, if they will contemplate it in all of its attitudes and trace it to its consequences, they will not hesitate to part with trivial objections to a constitution, the rejection of which would be in all probability put a final period to the Union. The airy phantoms that flit before the distempered imaginations of some of its adversaries would quickly give place to the more substantial forms of danger, real, certain, and formidable. Publius. Hamilton urges people to think about this seriously and calmly in order to weigh the pros and cons, and costs and benefits of the Constitution juxtaposed to individual sovereign states or confederacies, which would quickly devolve into the tyranny and despotism they just fought a revolution a decade previously to overcome and reject.
Here's the silence howling, it catches angels as they fall, and the all-time wind